You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. Like, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Right, it's broken or it's not.
Exactly. It's clean, it's visible, and it's categorized.
But step into the world of human behavior or, into the intersections of law and psychology, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just, it's broken. You are looking at a landscape that is, well, the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah, and today we are taking that broken X-ray machine and we're pointing it at the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan. We are bringing you along on a deep dive into a really highly unusual stack of sources. We've got a mix of official legal documents, a smuggled, they call it a blood letter defense, written from inside a Chinese prison, and these incredibly deep physical and psychological analyses of his specific legal battle.
Because he's a complex systems physicist.
Right.
And he was sentenced to 20 months in prison in China for the pocket crime of picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
But before we go a single step further, we do need to address the elephant in the room regarding these sources. We are looking at some highly charged political documents regarding the Chinese judicial system. So just to be incredibly clear to you listening, our goal today isn't to take sides, and we are absolutely not endorsing the viewpoints of the original authors.
Yeah, that's really important. We are analyzing this strictly to impartially report on the ideas, the physics and the psychology contained in this source material.
Right. We are treating this localized clash as a lens to understand the broader mechanics of how individuals survive rigid systems. Because, this isn't just a true crime legal story. As we dig into these sources, you're going to see this real-time collision between network physics, motivation psychology, and honestly, the absolute limits of emotional survival.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's just start with the physical reality of the arrest itself. Setting the scene, in September 2022, Dr. Chen was arrested in Kunming. The police storm his house, they confiscate his electronics.
The computer, the phone, the hard drives.
Yeah, all of it.
Yeah.
And they force him to hand over his passwords. And then they spent this massive amount of time scouring decades of data. We're talking every bank transfer, every single file, and the quote-unquote evidence that they walked away with was just sporadic retweets from an account with fewer than 100 followers.
Right. It's a tiny, almost completely invisible digital footprint. But the crux of the state's case for picking quarrels and provoking trouble rested entirely on those retweets.
Which is wild.
It is. The prosecutors argued these posts caused severe public disorder. And the source material actually categorizes the posts Chen retweeted into 4 distinct buckets, which is fascinating.
Okay, let's break those down.
So the first bucket is art and cartoons. Like there was the drawing of an umbrella girl from the Hong Kong protests and a satirical cartoon featuring Xi Jinping and Donald Trump.
Okay.
The second category is subjective emotional expressions. So just personal feelings, like retweeting a picture of a candlelight vigil on June 4th.
Which is, that's purely symbolic. There's no factual claim or call to action being made there.
Right, exactly. Then the third category is theoretical and political articles. These are things like speeches by Donald Trump criticizing communism or analytical essays by different political scholars.
Okay, and the fourth?
The fourth category is historical facts. Things like the editing history of Mao Zedong's selected works or just old newspaper clippings from the 1980s.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because looking at those 4 categories, it sounds like he was essentially using his timeline as a digital bookmarking tool for academic research?
That's exactly what it looks like.
Because he's a complex systems researcher, right? He's gathering data points, logging multiple perspectives, archiving historical documents. So how does bookmarking historical and theoretical documents translate to a major criminal charge of severe public disorder?
And that right there is the core question Dr. Chen raised in his defense. But what's amazing is he didn't just argue the legal definitions, He argued the math.
He brought in the physics.
Yes. He moved the defense from this subjective legal charge of severe public disorder directly into the objective scientific reality of network physics. Because the prosecution's argument, it relied on this massive assumption. They assumed that by retweeting these items, Chen was launching a massive destabilizing wave of information into the public sphere.
Right.
And Chen used his own field to mathematically dismantle the mechanics of that exact assumption.
But wait, I want to push back on that for a second, because we've all heard of the butterfly effect, right?
Sure.
A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and sets off a tornado in Texas. In a highly connected digital world like ours, Couldn't one retweet from a small account theoretically spark a massive viral avalanche that, actually does cause public disorder? Like, isn't that mathematically possible?
Well, it is an intuitive leap, and
Yeah.
it's actually the exact leap the prosecution made. But if we examine the mechanics of actual network physics, which the sources break down meticulously,
Mm,
by the way, the butterfly effect is a totally flawed model for this scenario,
really? Why?
because the butterfly effect requires a highly sensitive, chaotic, but universally interconnected system where every single node has equal potential to influence the whole.
Oh, and social media platforms don't work like that.
Exactly. They do not operate that way at all. They operate as what physicists call a scale-free network.
Okay, so the structure of the network itself actually prevents the butterfly from causing the tornado.
Right. In a scale-free network, the distribution of connections follows a power law.
Mm.
So you have a microscopic number of massive hubs-like accounts with millions of followers
Yeah.
and then billions of tiny marginal nodes.
The normal people.
Right. And the platform algorithms are mathematically designed to amplify the hubs and suppress the marginal nodes. Dr. Chen's account, with fewer than 100 followers and almost zero interaction, was a classic marginal node.
Yeah.
He wasn't just unlikely to go viral. The physics of the platform were actively working against him.
Which makes sense. And to understand if a marginal node can actually break through that suppression and cause a viral avalanche, physicists look at the Galton-Watson extinction theorem, right?
They do, yeah. The theorem calculates the average branching number of an event. Think of it like the R0 value in epidemiology, but for information.
Like how many people catch the virus from one person.
Exactly. If one person shares a post, how many people on average will share it from them? For an information cascade to happen, that average branching number must be greater than 1. If it's less than 1, the cascade decays exponentially.
It just dies out.
Right. And for a marginal node like Chen's, his average branching number was a tiny fraction. He was operating deep in what physics calls the subcritical zone.
So mathematically speaking, according to the Galton-Watson theorem, the extinction probability of his information cascade was essentially 100%.
100%.
The math definitively proves his retweets would die out almost immediately. And he brought these receipts in the form of mathematical theorems directly into the courtroom. So how did the prosecution handle a literal mathematical proof of his innocence?
Oh, they bypassed it entirely.
You're kidding.
No, the sources document this really jarring interaction where the prosecutor openly stated he didn't bother to verify the posts or their reach or the math. He argued that he simply felt they were rumors and that because Chen was highly educated, he, quote, should have known he was causing disorder.
Wow.
Yeah. The prosecution substituted their subjective perception of risk for objective, measurable physics.
But if his math definitively proves zero impact, why did the prosecution double down? Like, what is happening inside the minds of these officials that allows them to push for a 20-month sentence when the physics literally scream otherwise?
Well, the psychological analyses in our sources shift the lens here from physics over to motivation psychology to answer that exact question. We have to look at the underlying engines driving human behavior.
Okay.
The experts apply Edward Dacey and Richard Ryan's self-determination theory, which contrasts how different internal and external pressures dictate our actions. So, Dr. Chen is overwhelmingly driven by intrinsic epistemic motivation. That's a deep-seated need for truth-seeking, mapping out complex systems, and intellectual autonomy.
Meaning his motivation to bookmark those posts wasn't to incite a riot. It was this internal drive to understand the world, to compare viewpoints, seek consistency in data. He is driven by the internal reward of comprehension itself.
Exactly. But the judicial system is operating on a completely different psychological engine. They are running on extrinsic risk avoidance motivation.
Extrinsic, so external factors.
Right. The system is not optimizing for truth. It is optimizing for stability and self-preservation. The prosecutors and judges face immense top-down pressure. In fact, the sources note a prosecutor admitting that upper leadership demanded an ironclad case.
An ironclad case over some retweets.
Yeah. They were mandated to secure a conviction. When a bureaucracy's survival depends on avoiding a superior's wrath and maintaining a baseline of control, ambiguity itself becomes a mortal threat.
So what does this all mean? It's like they are playing two completely incompatible games. Dr. Chen is playing chess, right? Exploring complex possibilities, anticipating branching outcomes, seeking objective truth.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And the system is playing whack-a-mole, They are blindly hammering down anything that pops up and looks like an anomaly just to maintain a flat, controllable surface. They aren't looking at the chess pieces at all. They just want the board cleared.
And because their motivational frameworks are diametrically opposed, they literally cannot comprehend one another. The system views Chen's academic curiosity not as an intellectual exercise, but as malicious, intentional defiance.
Which leads to that really intense moment in the document.
Yes, there is a moment during the interrogations that perfectly isolates this disconnect. A prosecutor actually yells at Chen, accusing him of being an ungrateful PhD. He says Chen is, quote, eating the party's food and smashing the party's pot.
Wow, I mean, that phrase completely exposes the prosecutor's extrinsic transactional mindset. To the prosecutor, Chen's education was just a ledger entry, like the system provided resources, so Chen owes the system absolute ideological compliance.
Exactly. But for Chen, his education was an intrinsic calling. It was a drive to pursue knowledge regardless of the boundaries. And because the prosecutor cannot fathom intrinsic motivation, he interprets Chen's intellectual independence as an act of profound, almost treasonous betrayal.
But if the system's logic is fundamentally broken, and they are ignoring basic math because of this massive extrinsic pressure, how do the officials involved actually process this reality? Like, how do they pass a 20-month sentence on a man with zero mathematical impact and still sleep at night?
Well, the psychological texts in our sources point to something called emotion-driven cognition and the affect heuristic.
The affect heuristic.
Right. It's a mental shortcut where a person's immediate emotional response dictates their decisions. It entirely overrides their prefrontal cortex and objective logic.
Just bypassing the rational brain completely.
Completely. The officials felt a deep organizational anxiety and a visceral moral outrage at Chen's perceived defiance. Their fear and anger literally short-circuited their cognitive ability to process Chen's equations. Their feelings became the facts.
So if they are relying on the affect heuristic, their fear just overrides the math entirely, but they still have to face the reality that they are locking up a brilliant physicist for retweeting cartoons. That has to cause massive cognitive dissonance, right? You can't view yourself as a righteous agent of the law if you acknowledge you're destroying an innocent man.
Oh, absolutely. And to resolve that cognitive dissonance, the system employs moral disengagement. They have to fundamentally rewrite who Dr. Chen is in their own minds.
They change his identity.
Yeah, they cannot look at him as a complex systems physicist. They strip away his expertise, his dignity, and his humanity. This is why the official documents repeatedly refer to him as an, quote, unemployed vagrant.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because calling him an unemployed vagrant makes it emotionally manageable for the system to crush him. It's a psychological defense mechanism. Like, if he's just a vagrant causing trouble, the judge doesn't have to feel guilty about ignoring the Galton-Watson extinction theorem. It's systemic emotional self-defense, but at the cost of a man's life.
Exactly. Which brings us to the ultimate question of the case. When an immovable truth seeker is crushed by an unstoppable, fear-driven bureaucracy, how does the individual survive?
Yeah.
How does Dr. Chen sit in a prison cell watching his logic be ignored and his identity be erased without collapsing into total psychological despair?
Well, the sources lean heavily on Richard Lazarus's appraisal theory and James Gross's emotion regulation model to explain his survival, because appraisal theory argues that our emotions aren't caused directly by events, but by how we evaluate and frame those events.
Yes. If Chen evaluated his situation purely as, I'm a helpless victim being destroyed by a corrupt local court, the resulting emotional cascade would just be paralyzing.
The natural human response to that level of powerlessness is expressive suppression. You just bottle up the anger and the terror until you burn out or break.
But Chen bypassed expressive suppression entirely. He utilized the highest level of emotion regulation available, which is cognitive reappraisal and meaning-making.
And he didn't just try to, think positive thoughts. He completely rewrote the threat profile of his environment. He intellectually reframed his entire imprisonment, elevating it from a local, unfair trial to a civilizational fault line.
That's such a powerful phrase.
It is. He viewed his prosecution as a real-time historical experiment showcasing the collision between rational science and irrational bureaucracy.
And by doing that, he reclaimed his autonomy. He smuggled out his bloodletter defense, but the psychological experts note he wasn't writing that defense for the judge. He knew the judge was blinded by the affect heuristic. He was writing a historical archive for future readers.
It's like he treated his own mind as an isolated control room. The external chaos, the trial, the interrogations, the prisons, it was all just raw data flashing on a screen. By archiving it for the future, he stripped the immediate emotional threat away and just became an observer.
Right.
He protected his sanity by refusing to play their whack-a-mole game. He transformed intense frustration into this majestic, tragic sense of mission. The prison could lock up his physical body, but they couldn't stop him from testifying to the future.
And that level of cognitive reappraisal requires an incredibly integrated and resilient personality. He didn't suppress his fear. He channeled it into a highly structured, rational defense of truth. He maintained his intrinsic motivation even when every single external force was trying to crush it out of him.
The scale of Dr. Chen's story is obviously extreme, but the psychological mechanics at play here, they really touch all of our lives. I mean, we all navigate systems that are rigid, bureaucratic, and often driven by fear rather
Ah,
than logic.
oh, for sure.
Whether it's a toxic corporate workplace demanding metrics over quality, or a rigid school administration, or honestly just the invisible algorithms that dictate what we see and read online every day, we all have moments where we face systemic unfairness.
We do. And Chen's story is a masterclass in psychological resilience. It shows us that when you are trapped in a system, optimizing for risk avoidance, you don't have to internalize their panic. You can hold on to your intrinsic motivations. You can use cognitive reappraisal to reframe your struggles, find your own meaning, and protect your psychological core.
You can write your own story for the future, even if the present refuses to read it, which I think brings us to a lingering, provocative thought that builds on everything we've unpacked today. We've just spent this deep dive analyzing what happens when a human bureaucracy relies on the effect heuristic. When prosecutors base their decisions on fear, perceived threat, and the desperate need for control rather than facts and physics.
And we saw how it leads directly to the suppression of marginal nodes and the punishment of truth seekers.
Exactly. But as we look to the near future, we are increasingly handing over societal control, content moderation, and institutional decision-making to AI and complex algorithms. We are essentially building the ultimate automated bureaucracies.
Which is a terrifying thought when you put it in this context.
It really is. And the question is, are we inadvertently coding these exact same fear-based whack-a-mole emotional biases into our future systems? Like, if we train an AI to maximize safety and minimize anomalies above all else, will it become the ultimate extrinsic fear-driven prosecutor?
Wow.
Will the algorithms of tomorrow even be able to recognize a truth seeker? Or will they, just like the court in Kunming, simply see another anomaly to be erased? We started this deep dive talking about X-rays, how we want clear, visible lines of cause and effect. But human systems are murky. The diagnostic machine is broken. Yet, Dr. Chen's story proves that even in the most chaotic waters, the underlying structure of human resilience remains intact. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning the world around you, and we will catch you next time.